Okay, let's just do a very quick review. I just thought of an interesting name for the shiur. Is God a nobody? So that's what we're going to call this now. Is God a nobody? So of course the
Mr.
question
Nobody.
is, does God have a body? Which of course sounds ludicrous, but you'll see, it's not so ludicrous. Now, what we saw last time was that there are many psukim in Tanakh which are em- emphatic about the making the claim that God is a nobody, right? That God is utterly other, right? And perhaps the most dramatic example of that is the pasuk, the first one that I had listed here. V'nishmartem lo nafshotechem ki lo reitem kol tmuna b'yom diber Hashem aleichem v'chorev mitoch ha'esh. Right, you should be very careful. You didn't see any image when God spoke to you from Mount Sinai, out of the fire. So that's the most intimate kind of connection with God. And yet, remember, Moshe says before he dies, you didn't see anything because God is a nobody. And then we have a whole set of psukim, which we saw last time, which make the same point. God is utterly other, right? My thoughts are not your thoughts, etc.
I mean, does
Yes.
the fact that they didn't see anything, is that a proof?
Okay, so I don't know if it's an Aristotelian proof, right? But since that is the most intimate and direct experience of God that we've ever had as a nation collectively, and the fact that there was no material representation of God is a way of I don't think it's trying to make a philosophical route, but an experiential point that God is trying to tell you something by not by the fact that you didn't see anything. Because God is a nobody.
I mean, we can speak with many people today without seeing them. I mean, so what?
Yeah. So the Rambam takes this from a totally different approach, and also anybody else who is interested in a more Aristotelian approach, and their approach is that anything which is material, now any kind of bodily form is material by definition, and so anything which has material form is limited by definition. It's limited both in maybe you could say quantity and quality. So in quantity, in the sense that it has dimensionality, right? And in quality, that it's transient. So since we start out with the premise that the prime mover, well, the PM, the prime mover must must be perfect, because it's that which moves everything else, but it itself is not moved. It's independent from any other force moving it, so it is infinite and perfect. This is sort of a very quick summary of kind of the Maimonidean Aristotelian approach. It therefore must have all the qualities of perfection. So anything that is dimensional or transient cannot possibly be God. Right? So that's the base outline. So you're right. The verse doesn't say that. The verse doesn't speak in philosophical language. But like I said, it speaks from an experiential point of view. And the Rambam probably assumed that Moshe Rabbeinu gave a shiur in Mor Nevuchim as soon as he was done with this oration to explain the more philosophical basis of his
But even
argument.
that is a little bit of circular reasoning, isn't it? I mean, I can create the rules and then fit the arguments so the rules are met. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. So I'll tell you. Okay. So every scientific proof or philosophical proof ultimately begins with certain axioms, and axioms I think are defined. That term means certain assumptions which are reasonable, but cannot necessarily be proven. This notion that you have the prime mover, right? That he moves or it moves everything else, but it itself is not moved. So within the worldview of the metaphysics of Aristotle, so it's necessary to have that primal force if you assume all the other elements of how he viewed the mechanics, essentially mechanics, of how the universe works. And within that system, you have to have something which is the original source of motion, right? Motion. but it's perfect because, or else it is dependent upon something else moving it. So, the fact that everything keeps moving means there's something which has an eternal, transient ability to move others, but does not have any imperfection of itself. So, like I said, everything ultimately has axioms, and that's the axiom there. So that's the nature of things. The Rambam had a great deal of confidence in these kind of philosophical proofs. He thought they were incontrovertible, but whatever, you don't have to buy into it. Now, we then saw, unfortunately, that there are many psukim which describe God in the most crass physical terms, that he has legs, he sits on the throne. These are all psukim. He has eyes, he sees, he talks, that he puts on tefillin. And we even saw the most shocking source, which is from this work, Shiur Koma, which actually, speaking of dimensionality, it is a book which does nothing else. See, all these other prophetic books, or even the Chumash itself, it may say God spoke to Moshe, but then there's something else besides the speaking. It'll describe the content of the speech, which could be very inspiring and important. Shiur Koma doesn't do anything else but relate the measurements of God. His arms are this long. His nose is this long. He's this tall. There's no message other than, in case you ever wanted to know, you want to buy God a new suit from Brooks Brothers, so you have to take his measurements. So here's the measurements. This is why Jews became tailors. I'm sorry?
It can't be like one part of God, the part that he wants you to see, and the rest
okay. Good. So now, thank you for that comment. And that leads us to the next point that I think we had done this last time, but we'll just do a quick review. So how did the Rishonim deal with this contradiction? On the one hand, you have psukim which say God is utterly transcendent, he's utterly other. On the other hand, you have both psukim and passages from Chazal that talk about God in very physical terms, and Shiur Koma, book I just mentioned, which presumably comes from the time of the Second Temple. I think that's the assumption, or not much after that. Or the Heichalot literature, this kind of all these Kabbalistic images of God sitting on a throne and describing God in very physical terms. So how did the Rishonim deal with that? So Rav Saadia Gaon said something really interesting. And I think I will read this inside, even though I think we did it last time, because it exactly touches on what you just mentioned, and also will become very important at the next stage of our discussion. So Rav Saadia Gaon says the following. This is just a short excerpt from his Emunot Videot. And he says the following: Kvar hevi b'mevucha achadim mibnei Adam inyan Moshe Rabbeinu he'ach sha'al et Hashem hareini na et kodecha. People are so confused. How did Moshe ask God, show me your kavod? Like, I'd like to see you. I kind of would like to feel you as being very real. Show me your kavod. It sounds like he's saying, like, show me yourself. And that's why I have all these traditions of God showing him his back, but not his front, even though it's based on psukim. And they saw the back of the tefillin, right? That's an agadah from Chazal. What? V'omar. Why do you deal with that? So Rav Saadia Gaon says the following: Be'ezrat harachaman. So I'm going to explain to you with God's help. Begilui chozeh ubioro. I'll explain the whole thing. Don't worry about it. Yesh Lashem zohar she'u borei oto umegaleu ledivim. God has a certain radiance. Remember the word Zohar. Not Zohar like in Kabbalah, Zohar, like the book, but a radiance that God created, and he reveals it to the prophets. It's in order that they should know that this prophecy that they're receiving really comes from God, because, look, there's God. Right? You didn't take too much LSD for breakfast. This is not a figment of your imagination. This is God speaking to you, and you see that God's right over there. So Rav Saadia says that they did see things, and it's exactly what you said. But that it's a kind of a, I think there's the word apparition. I think there's such a word in English. It's a kind of an image which God creates. And he calls it a Zohar, or in Tanakh, it's called Kavod. So it's a kind of, what do you call it? There's a word in English where you can create like a 3D image. Help me out. I'm sorry?
A simulation?
Well, not quite. There's like
A hologram.
hologram. Thank you, like a hologram.
Like
I
the
think they even have
holodeck on
now.
Star Trek. The
Yeah,
holodeck.
I think they actually have now like real technology that you can have like a video conference, and you sort of create like a virtual image of the person. It feels very real. So that's what God did. Okay. So v'chasher ro'eh oto echad mehem, when one of the prophets sees the Zohar, this kavod, this hologram, Omer, he says, Ra'iti kvod Hashem. Well, I'll be among his uncle. He says, I saw the glory of God. I saw God. B'yesh sha'af omer ra'iti et Hashem. I've seen God. But it doesn't really mean it in the sense that you might think. He saw a hologram created by God, but he didn't see God. כמשפט המילים הנסתרות, אבל הבורא עצמו אין אפשרות שיראהו שום אדם. So this is this hologram which God created, but God himself, no, nobody can see him. It's impossible. So therefore, just to make a summary, Rav Saadia Gaon says that these images that the prophets had of God were real images, but they're images. There are artificial, synthetic, divinely created holograms of God, but not God himself. God himself, one cannot see. That's a pretty daring explanation, by the way.
Is that something similar to an altered state of consciousness?
Yeah, you would have to have an altered state of consciousness to experience this hologram, but it could be that you didn't necessarily achieve it through having LSD for breakfast. God gave it to you, right? God wants you to receive a prophecy. He wants you to know that's really coming from him. So he shows you this hologram, and that makes you feel this prophecy is very real. By the way, I mean, there's all kinds of problems with this, but we start off with the pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu said, where you were at Mount Sinai and you didn't see any tuna. Wait a second. According to Rav Saadia Gaon, they could have seen a tuna, they could have seen an image, because God could have created a hologram in that all the nation would have seen. And that would actually help them to accept the veracity of the prophetic experience that they all shared together. And I don't know, maybe Rav Saadia Gaon thinks that, I don't think he would say that they did see something like that, because then the verse wouldn't make sense. But because you have these other psukim, which do this, like in Ezekiel and in many other books of the prophets and in Chazal, crazy. And so
Doesn't
he
say
had to
that
deal
they
with that.
doesn't say that they saw the sounds.
Yeah.
Well, whatever that means, they saw something.
Yeah. So
It wasn't there.
Yeah. So I have an explanation of that, but I don't want to go into it. It's just put that aside for now. It's we'll do it with another time. It's a really interesting sort of semi-Kabbalistic explanation of that. Okay. Now the Rambam certainly does not, even though Rav Saadia Gaon was philosophically oriented, but the Rambam is much more pure in his approach towards is God a nobody. And we saw this last time, and it's very famous. The Rambam rejects totally this notion that God has a body, and he rejects totally Rav Saadia Gaon's suggestion that God kind of created a hologram of himself. And all of the images that we read about in either rabbinic Agadot or in Tanakh, it's all a metaphor. And Dibra Torah Klashon B'nei Adam, the Torah speaks the language of man, right? The people need something concrete in order to talk about God. There's no way to talk about God in a total abstraction. And so therefore the Torah speaks in human language, and that's the famous principle. And the Rambam goes so far as to say that this is one of the 13 principles of faith. And if you don't believe in this, you are a heretic. If you think God has some kind of physical qualities, some bodily qualities, you are a heretic. And you lose your place in the world to come and all kinds of terrible things. Okay, now, the Rambam also, he comments on the Shir Koma. That's that extremely anthropomorphic book, which does nothing other than describe God's dimensions. He says in this tshuva that he thinks it's a forgery and it should be destroyed. And Rav Saadia Gaon also relates to the issue of Shir Koma, and he says he's not sure exactly where it comes from, so the jury's out according to Rav Saadia Gaon. The Rambam says it's just a forgery, it should be burned. Fine. Now, the thing that strikes me as being particularly problematic, if I were to ask any of you, how do you deal with these very anthropomorphic images of God? You would all say, the Torah speaks the language of men. That's become so ingrained in us that we don't even question the use of that principle. And so this is the last thing we saw last time, I think, according to my notes. Well, I showed you where that principle comes from. It comes from the Talmud. The problem is that the Talmud always uses it every single time without exception in a very specific way. When there is a dispute between two sages in the Talmud about whether we should interpret the duplication of a term in the Torah, which seems to us superfluous, like mot yumat, dying he shall die. That's how you would translate that literally. Dying he shall die, mot yumat. Mot is an infinitive, dying. Yumat will die or be put to death. Or karet karet, cutting off he shall be cut off. So the sages will often have a dispute where one of them will say, oh, it says karet to tell you that you'll be cut off in this world. Ye karet, oh, that's not superfluous. That's not there just for emphasis. That's till you'll be cut off from the world to come too. And the other opinion will say, no, that sometimes a superfluous word can be there just because that's the way we talk. I really, 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 really mean this. You don't have to darshan the fact that I said really, 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 really mean this. I'm just trying to emphasize the point. So that phrase, Dibrat Torah Lashon Bnei Adam, is never, ever, ever, ever used in the Talmud, where it comes from, to say that this is a metaphor. Never. Without exception, it always means that we don't have to necessarily darshan a word which seems superfluous, because the Torah speaks in the manner of human speech, which sometimes will repeat a word just for emphasis. This is shocking. This is really shocking, because we take it for granted. I don't lose any sleep over anthropomorphic images in Tanakh or in Chazal, because Dibrat Torah Lashon Bnei Adam. Huh? That's not what that phrase means in its source. Unless you want to say, the Rambam say that it's a metaphor, and I'm going to borrow artificially a phrase from the Talmud and use it in a way which is not the way it was used in the Talmud. And I'm not claiming the Talmud says this. It's my own principle. Doesn't sound like that. It sounds like the Rambam is saying, look in the Talmud. The Talmud itself says you don't have to take everything as being darshanable. Sometimes things shouldn't be taken so literally.
Did you cover the idea of when God talks to people through angels that they see, that's not some manifestation of a physicality of God?
Yeah, so that's actually, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I talked about it, but it's very close to Rav Saadia Gaon, but different. So Rav Saadia Gaon thinks that God has this hologram, whereas the Rambam would say that God creates apparitions, right, these kind of images, but not of himself. Like the three angels that come to Abraham, right? Tell him wife's gonna have a baby, etc. So the Rambam says that didn't happen if you were standing there, you wouldn't have seen it. That was a dream or a vision. But then the Torah, because the Torah describes God coming to Abraham, and then all of a sudden there's three angels, and is this God or the three angels? So, but the Rambam doesn't go so far as say that God created a hologram of himself in the form of three angels. That God created some these angels, whatever they look like, which he then saw in his sleep or in a vision, like the talking donkey, same approach, which might communicate a message from God. But he doesn't say what Rav Saadia Gaon says. So Rav Saadia Gaon says that it's actually a divine image, right?
But that would be enough. That would be enough to then say, when we refer to the nose of God, the hand of God, the head of it, that in fact it's referring to those images which God chooses to send in some physicality, so to speak. I mean, whether it's a dream or a hologram, but that's what it's referring to, as opposed to just a metaphor.
Yeah. So so Rav Saadia Gaon could understand it more easily Shir Koma like that, right? When it describes God's dimensions, it's actually describing what the hologram looked like. That works better with Rav Saadia Gaon. A little more difficult for the Rambam to say such a thing, and I think that's probably the reason that the Rambam just said it should be burned. It's very hard to redeem Shir Koma if you hold like the Rambam.
Can
yeah.
Can I take issue with your idea, your translation of Saadia Gaon's idea of the Zohar?
Yeah.
A hologram, because to me it's just a haze, it's a mist, a light. It doesn't have to have any human shape or at all. So, you also pointed out that it would, according to him, there might be a problem with, we didn't see any image on the mount. Well, we didn't see an image. We saw this mist. That's all we saw.
Yeah. So that's a good point. And I have seen people who describe Saadia Gaon more in the terms you're talking about, that it's sort of like a mist, or it's not an actual figure of a person. That would, if we would limit Rav Saadia Gaon's talking about a Zohar and a Kavod in that way, that would solve that problem. But I'm not so sure that Rav Saadia Gaon's notion of Zohar or Kvod Hashem is such a diffuse, cloud kind of image.
Because according to you, I tell you, my problem is, according to what you said, I'm calling it a hologram, which to me is indicating there's some kind of image of a human or something similar to that. It's a picture of something that we would recognize, that human beings would recognize. My problem with that is, then isn't that a slippery slope? And then you would say, okay, so God can walk among us. So, on earth, any time we see something weird, a person that looks weird, well, that doesn't have to be Eliyahu Hanavi. That could be God appearing to us as an apparition, which, is objectionable on all sorts of levels.
So I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure if Saadia Gaon would think it's a problem, because even if he means, which he might mean, that it could appear in a more concrete form, this Zohar, as long as you say, but that's not God, it's a creation of God, so then I don't really see the problem, right? There's no slippery slope, as long as I'm careful to distinguish between God and this synthetic image, even a sharp and focused image with specific form. As long as I make that distinction, then I'm safe according to Rav Saadia.
Yeah, but we don't have any indication of the Tanakh. Look, you don't have to be a Rambamist and accept everything that he says, which is that angels are never seen actually by man on earth, right? You don't have to accept that. You could go according to the Pshat and just say, yeah, every time it describes a Navi or Manoach's wife seeing an angel, yeah, she saw an angel, okay? But from there to take a quantum leap, to me, it is a quantum leap to say somebody saw an apparition of God or something that God created. I mean, where does that appear in Tanakh? There doesn't seem to be any description of something like that.
Well, we have a Yechezkel of God sitting on a throne. I mean, we do have very anthropomorphic images in Tanakh, especially Yechezkel.
That's
But there
truly
are other
like
examples.
hua or dream or something. We're not, it doesn't say that Yechezkel was walking down the street and saw that. He may have been lying down on a bed and seeing that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do have even in Torah itself, which tends to be more pure than Nach, that passage which I quoted here about Vayiru et Elohei Yisrael. They saw the God of Israel, and underneath his legs was a sapphire brick. That's a pasuk in Torah. What does that mean?
Okay.
So, yeah. So Rav Saadia deals with it by making a distinction between like a hologram and God Himself. You're going to see how Rav Saadia is attacked mercilessly for this idea. We'll get there in just a few minutes, hopefully. So now, I want to share with you this super famous attack on the Rambam's pure monotheism. This is a very, very famous issue, where when the Rambam says that, if you think God is a body, you're in very big trouble, right? So the Ra'avad, or the Raavad, as they say in Yeshiva, Rabbi Avram ben David, lived in southern France in the 12th century. He's a contemporary of the Rambam, but he's senior to the Rambam. He's older. And the Ra'avad was a very respected Torah scholar in his time. There are historians who think that his critical stance towards the Rambam was motivated by a certain sense that, who's this young whippersnapper who's trying to take away my kavod? So I, generally speaking, don't like that approach, but there may be some truth to it. He wrote very critical comments throughout the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, and they're all printed in any classical edition of the Mishneh Torah, right? Embedded into the text of the Rambam in very small print. So this is probably the most famous comment of the Ra'avad. So, right, the Rambam says in Hilchot Tshuva, right, anybody who says that there is a God, but he has some kind of physical features, so you're a heretic. So the Rambam says, why does he call such one a non-believer? Many great and better than he followed this opinion according to what they saw in phrases, right, in the Torah and Tanakh, and more particularly in the texts of the Aggadot, the Talmudic passages, Midrashim, which confuse opinions. So, oh my. So the Ra'avad here, we got to be careful here. He's not saying that you say God doesn't have a body and I say he does. But he is saying, what kind of arrogance you have, Rambam? Because I agree with you philosophically, God doesn't have a body. But there are greater, better people than you, Rambam, who took Tanakh and Agadah more literally than you do, and it confuses you. How could you say that somebody who takes Tanakh and Agadah more at face value than you do, that person is a heretic and lost the place in the world to come? I know many of those rabbis, and I can understand why they got confused, and they are greater than you. As he says in Hebrew, Kama Gedolim V'Tovim Mimenu. Right? Great, Tovim V'Gedolim. They're greater and better than him. Okay, I just want to show you a little interesting kind of a footnote on this. This comment of the Ra'avad has bothered so many people since it was written in the 12th century. The Chazon Ish, so 20th century, one of the greatest, most respected Torah scholars in 20th century, he wanted to suggest, because he was so uncomfortable with the Ra'avad's comment and the chutzpah saying that many greater people in the Rambam who took these teachings at face value got confused. How can you call them better? Gedolim V'Tovim Mimenu. So he wanted to say, the Rambam didn't put vowels in his text of the Mishneh Torah. So maybe we should read it, V'chama Gedolim V'Tovim Mimenu, that there are great and good ones from among us. Mimenu translated as from among us, rather than mimeno, which means more than him. So that was sort of a little way of blunting the critical comment by saying, well, there are some fine Jews. I shouldn't say this, but I will anyway. The way Trump, after that infamous march that took place someplace in the American South, over there, and he said there were fine people there. So this is the way the Chazon Ish understood the Ra'avad. There's some fine Jews, right, from among us who were confused because they took these things at face value. That doesn't mean more than him. Okay, so that takes maybe a little bit of the sting off of this critical remark. But the point remains the same, that the Ra'avad did not think that taking these texts at face value is some kind of it's going to condemn you to purgatory forever. Clearly didn't think that. Now I want to explore this Ra'avad. What exactly is bothering him, and what's his point?
That's a philosophical argument. Do people worry about what they said, like that might have some validity, like if they believe it, who knows, they won't get Alma? How seriously was this taken, or was it just an academic argument?
I'm sorry, I didn't say it again. I didn't catch the question.
We have academic arguments today. The average guy on the street could care less. I'm wondering what people might have taken from the fact that these people were arguing among themselves. Did it affect the average Jew in the street that, the Rambam says I'm losing on the Rabba, that's it, my life's over, I might as well kill myself now? I mean, what was the effect of that, or was it just among academics?
Okay, so that's I can't answer that question. I don't know what the average Jew in the street thought about this, but among the rabbis, this is huge, as you're going to see in just a second. It's huge. As a matter of fact, I was going to share this with you at the end, but I'm going to do it right now. You forced me into it because I think it partially addresses your question. I want to show you something from the 18th century. This is already 600 years later. And I was going to show it to you at the end because it's funny. To my mind, it's funny. So I don't know if it was meant to be funny. So I want to show you something. Let me just scroll down to it here. There's a lot of sources here, as you can see. This is a big job here, but I had fun. So hang on a second. Okay. So how did was this just an academic discussion between the Rambam and the Raavad, or does this have like implications that bothered people? So I want to share with you a text. This is a teaching in the name of the Koznitzer Maggid. Okay, he had a real name. Right? His name is Rabbi Yisrael Hopstein of Koznitz. That's why he's called the Koznitzer Maggid. So 18th century Poland, very famous Hasidic Rebbe, Koznitzer Maggid. So he's being quoted here in a different text by this Hungarian rabbi. So he says the following: "Shamati b'shem Maggid HaKadosh miKoznitz." So this Hungarian rabbi is quoting the Koznitzer Maggid. Shamar la Rambam. He said, the Koznitzer Maggid, concerning the Rambam, Hilchot Tshuva, Perek Gimel, Halacha Zayin, Chamisha Nikrim, meaning 5, it quotes now the Rambam, 5 people are called heretics. Among them, Homer Sheyesh Ribon Echad, Aval Shehu Bal Tmuna. Someone who says there is a sovereign, but he has physical features. The Amar HaRaavad, now he quotes the famous Raavad that we just learned. Lama Karala Zemin. Why is he calling that person a heretic? There are better people than him that went in this thought that God has some kind of physical features. Because they saw in Tanakh, etc., images which suggest God has a body. Okay, so far the Kodesh Maggid is just quoting the Rambam and the Raavad's response. V'amar Rava Maggid Zatzal. So the Maggid, the Koznitzer, right? He said the following: B'shah she'amar harambam halachazo, when the Rambam formulated this halacha, that if you believe God has a body, that you are going to go to hell, one-way ticket. Nithaveh choshech gadol ba'olam ha'elyon. That at that moment there was a tremendous darkness which was created in the spiritual world. Machmat shegarshu migan Eden, tilei tilim nishamot shalchu b'zeh machshava. Be all these, he says, piles and piles of souls that were in the Garden of Eden. All these Jews for thousands of years who died and believe God has a body and are now in paradise after they died. All of a sudden, the lights went out in paradise. And they all were forced to go to hell because the Rambam paskined that if you think God has a body, you go to hell. So all of these Jews who were in heaven, when the Rambam paskined what he paskined, God had to agree. Even the Rambam, even God holds like the Rambam. So therefore, God said, "Sorry, guys, down to hell, one-way ticket." The Rambam paskined that way. What can I do? This is what the Kodesh Magid said. V'kasher ra'ah ha'raivid shenit laveh choshek gadol ba'olam ha'elyon. Now the Ravid, when he saw that because the Rambam caused God to throw out of heaven thousands of Jews who believed God had a body, and now they're consigned to purgatory forever. When the Rambam, when the Ravid noticed that, dacha haravid halachazo. So the Ravid rejected this halacha shamar harambam, what the Rambam said. V'chazru kol shemot l'gan Eden. And immediately God said, "Oh, I hold like the Ravid," and all the souls that had been thrown down into hell returned back to heaven. It's a great story. It's a great story. Now, I'm not sure if the Kodesh Magid meant this as a joke or he meant it seriously, but I think it does partially reflect, Bruce, your question that to what extent did this sort of resonate among the populace? And I think that Kodesh Magid kind of expressed this idea that the Rambam's pure monotheism was condemnatory, right? Because I'm a simple Jew and I'm a good Jew, but I think God has certain physical features. And look what the Rambam has done to me, how he delegitimized. Oh, it came out. Delegitimized me. I'm consigned to hell. But the Ravid, who was the defender of the simple Jew, obviously the Ravid was a Hasidic Rebbe, right? I don't mean that seriously, right? But he defended the little man, the simple man, and he then contradicted the Rambam and liberated all those souls that had been thrown down into hell so they could go back up to the Garden of Eden. Now, I want to just finish this source here because I'm a little confused. I don't know who's talking. I made this into a separate paragraph here. I don't know if it's this Hungarian rabbi or the Kodesh Magid. I'm not sure. Nearly, it seems to me, I think it's the Hungarian rabbi. I'm not sure. Shishnehem divrei Elohim Chaim. He says, this Hungarian rabbi, that he holds, you know what? You know who's right? The Rambam or the Ravid? They're both right. They're both right. Well, how can they both be right? You're going to find out. Harambam Zatzal, Shelo Yada Adayin Mechokmat HaKabbalah, Shamar Halachazo, Achelo Sof Yamav Nitvada Lo Mechokmat HaKabbalah. So let's pause there for a second. The Rambam, when he wrote that, he had not been given the benefit of a Kabbalistic education. He didn't know about it. So based upon pure Aristotelian thinking, which is all the Rambam knew at that time, he didn't know about Kabbalah. So it's consistent with the premises of Aristotelian logic. But he can't be blamed, right? He just didn't know about Kabbalah. But if you remove Kabbalah from it, what the Rambam said is true. But you know what? Before the Rambam died, this amazing thing happened. He learned about Kabbalah. So at that point, the Rambam wanted to retract all of these radical, pure monotheistic ideas that he had written in his books. Now that he is truly enlightened, and he is on the basis of learning the Kabbalah towards the end of his life. The Ravid, Yadami Chochmat the Kabbalah, but the Ravid was a Kabbalist from day one. And that's why he said greater people than the Rambam were confused about this. Because after all, the Ravid is speaking from the perspective of the truth, the Kabbalah. Because according to Kabbalah, Hashem encloses himself in the worlds. And the worlds then manifest shiur demot koma, the measure of the image of the stature of God. You know what he's referring to when he says that phrase, shiur demot koma. Do you remember the book that I talked about, is the most radical expression of God's dimensions? It's called shiur koma. He's referring to that. So, because God does manifest himself in the world, and he manifests it through these images. That's what it means when God says, it says in the Torah, God created man is in his image. Because he does have an image. It's an image which is as described by the book. I'm sorry?
Is this something like these and those are the words of the living God? That kind of an idea?
That's the way he prefaced it. He said that both viewpoints are true based upon their own premises. So if you don't know about Kabbalah, then what the Rambam said is certainly true. But if you use the premises of Kabbalah, which he only had access to later in his life, if you accept the premise of Kabbalah, then you think like the Ravid. But even the Rambam did tshuva. Now, we don't have any written evidence of this, at least that he mentions, but we know that the Rambam, towards the end of his life, learned the Zohar and became a great Kabbalist and actually became a Lubavitcher. This is historical fact.
As a compromise, could we say that many Jews believe that God has anger, or he's happy when we do mitzvot, or is upset? We put those emotions, at least, they're not physical, but I think many people talk that way, at least, and maybe believe that.
Okay, so what do you think the Rambam would say about that? Like, see, we're describing God not as having physical features, but having emotions.
Well, we know exactly what the Rambam would say about that.
Yeah, because he says it.
Yeah.
He says, if you think God really gets sad or happy or depressed or angry, you're a heretic. Right? God doesn't have emotions. It's all a metaphor. It's a way of telling us God has a will, right? And there are implications for us if we follow God's will or not. God has no emotions. Emotions are a human feature.
I mean, if man created Dr. Spock, then God should certainly be beyond that, right?
I'm sorry, say it again, I'm sorry.
If man created Dr. Spock, who has no emotions, then...
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. And Leonard Nimoy, of course, was a Jew, actually pretty committed Jew. Okay, now, I want to go back to the Ravid. And I want to try to understand the Ravid better. Because it turns out the Ravid's criticism is not quite as focused as it may sound. The Ravid is saying, you think that one of the principles of faith is that God has no form. How could you, and if you believe that God has a form, you go to hell. And the Ravid's saying, there are greater people than you, Rambam, who thought God had a form because they took at face value Tanakh and Agadah. So, I mean, that's really interesting, but it's very focused on that particular issue of God having a body or not. We're going to look at Rav Yosef Albo, who agrees, I'll just tell you right now, sort of a spoiler alert, that he agrees with the Ravid. But he plays out all the implications, the much larger issue that is at stake here. This is really fascinating. It has global significance, as you'll see. And even so, Rav Yosef Albo.
When did he write? When is it?
Yeah. Okay. So Rav Yosef Albo, I think I have the dates up here. He's after the Rambam. So I don't have it here with me. Someone could look it up. 14th century, I think, is my my memory, but you can confirm that for me. So he holds like the Ravid. He wrote just a little bit about his book, Sefer Ikarim, the book of principles, Ikarim or principles. Rav Yosef Albo wrote this book to respond to the Rambam. Rambam says there are 13 principles of faith. Rav Yosef Albo says, you're out of your mind. I agree there are things we should believe in, but not 13, only 3. What I always like to point out is that the Rambam articulated his 13 principles of faith in a few paragraphs. Rav Yosef Albo wrote a 200-page work in Arabic to explain why you only need 3, not 13. That's the difference between the two. But of course, really, Rav Yosef Albo in Sefer Ikarim is creating a whole philosophical perspective, which is much larger than simply what are the principles of faith. He says the following. It is proper, however, to say this in justification of those Jewish scholars who deal with this subject. You can see he's talking about anthropomorphism. Every Israelite is obliged to believe that everything that is found in the Torah is absolutely true. We have to read this very carefully. It's really fascinating. And anyone who denies anything that is found in the Torah, knowing that it is the opinion of the Torah, is an unbeliever. As the rabbis say in chapter Chelek in Sanhedrin, which talks a lot about things for which you can lose your place in the world to come, that anyone who says the whole Torah emanates from the divine being, except one verse, which Moses said on his own authority, just made it up, is liable to the imputation charged in the biblical expression, which is the following. Is a verse, because he hath despised the word of the Lord and is classed among those who deny the divine inspiration of the Torah. Right? So someone who reads something in the Torah and says, I disagree. That can't, I disagree. Right? So that person has despised the word of the Lord and all the implications that go along with that. But that's very narrow, as you see. But a person who upholds the law of Moses and believes in its principles, but when he undertakes to investigate these matters with his reason and scrutinizes the text, is misled by his speculation and interprets a given principle otherwise than it is taken to mean at first sight, or denies the principle because he thinks that it does not represent a sound theory, which the Torah obliges us to believe, or erroneously denies that a given belief is a fundamental principle, which, however, he believes as he believes the other dogmas of the Torah, which are not fundamental principles, or entertains a certain notion in relation to one of the miracles of the Torah because he thinks it is not thereby denying any of the doctrines which is obligatory for us to believe by the authority of the Torah. Sorry for this long sentence. A person of this sort is not an unbeliever. He is classed with the sages and pious men of Israel, though he holds erroneous theories. His sin is due to error and requires atonement. Now, let's just talk about this. I don't know if you were able to understand what he said here. As a matter of fact, who would like to explain in simple language that even I can understand what Rav Yosef Albo is saying about what do you have to do to merit the term heretic? To merit that title, what do you have to do? In contrast to other things you may think, which you will not be a heretic for thinking them. Anybody like to try to translate into English what he just said in English?
Well, I know that he said that if you have erroneous beliefs on some levels, you're not off the you're not an unbeliever. You made an error in judgment that requires some kapara. What you have to believe in, I'm not sure. But
yeah, okay. So I know there's a lot of different categories, but that's the direction. Let's just flesh it out a bit. We start out by saying we're required to believe that the Torah is absolute transcendent truth, right? From beginning to end. So if you say one verse in the Torah, God didn't say that. Come on. No way. That doesn't reflect the divine opinion. So you're a heretic. Now, once you accept the premise that every word in the Torah has the divine stamp of approval. So you are no longer a heretic. Oh, wait, sorry, I said too much. If you believe that everything in the Torah, in fact, comes from God, but you happen to disagree with God, it's okay. God says homosexuality is forbidden, but I disagree. Or if you think that God couldn't have said that, right? That verse was written by a human being, his own opinion. So then you're a heretic. In other words, now, what makes you not a heretic? I'm a pious Jew. I believe every word comes from Hashem. It's just that I was confused in reading a verse. I'm not disagreeing with God. I thought that God meant that you're allowed to eat cheeseburgers. I misinterpreted the verse. So that's a mistake, but you're not a heretic.
No, I thought if you would read that the whole world was destroyed in a flood, and you read the whole world as saying a metaphor, would that make you? Does it mean that that's an erroneous belief? Because you're saying God said it.
Correct. You will not go to hell for that, at least according to Rabbi Yosef Albo.
As long as you do what you're supposed to be doing, whether you believe that God, do whatever, as long as you at the end of the day, you do what you're supposed to be doing.
Okay, that's a very good point you're making, because one could read Rabbi Yosef Albo like that. And we'll see very fine rabbis who say almost essentially that, right? That the bottom line is live as a Jew. On philosophical issues, as long as you accept that the Torah is true, but you have a different way of reading it, and you are convinced that that's the correct shot, it may be a mistake. And for that, you should do tshuva, like any kind of mistake. But that does not make you into a heretic, God forbid, and you will not go to hell. Just correct the mistake. And the bottom line is how you act. I think that's a very good point. Now, I think you can start to see how this is now creating a principle much larger than the specific issue of is God a nobody or not. We're now creating a principle about what qualifies you to be a heretic. Now, you see, the Rambam certainly doesn't agree with this, because according to Rabbi Yosef Albo, you got to try pretty hard to be a heretic. Because as long as you think the Torah is true, it's just you have a different shot. You may be mistaken, but you're not a heretic, as long as you keep kosher. Right? Okay, now he goes on. We find such opinions expressed by some of the ancient sages of Israel. Thus, we find a statement that temporal sequence existed before creation. What the author of this opinion meant to say is that the Torah does not oblige us to believe that time was itself created. Similarly, Rabbi Eliezer Gadol, in chapter 3 of his treatise, endeavors to name the material out of which the heavens and the earth were made. Now, if we should understand his words in their literal sense, as indicating, namely, that the world is not created of nothing, but out of something, namely out of a primitive matter, we should have no reason for bringing a charge against him, for his idea is that the Torah does not oblige us to believe in creation ex nihilo. He has no intention to anything that's in the Torah, heaven forbid. This is a really fascinating example, right? Did God create from nothing or from something? So that was a big dispute between the Rambam and Aristotle. Now, that's a philosophical issue. If you think that God created from something, there was some kind of primal matter that God used to create the world, you may be wrong, but you are definitely not a heretic. You could be a very pious Jew, but you may be mistaken in that particular understanding of the Torah. Maimonides also, the author of the Guide to the Perplexed, in chapter 25 of the second part, says that his belief in creation ex nihilo was not due to the authority of the scriptural text. Text can be reinterpreted, but to the fact that it is a true doctrine, and therefore the text must be interpreted to his harmonious with this doctrine. He's a really fascinating idea. He's going to use the Rambam against himself. He says, even you, Rambam, say that what the verses mean is very unclear, and that you, Rambam, were willing to take a philosophical premise and read it into the verse. And if you would have been convinced philosophically that the world always existed, there was some primal matter, you would have read the verses that way. But since you think that philosophically is not true, so you read the verses a different way. So it shows you that the Torah itself, the text, is ambiguous. And therefore, to say that somebody who accepts the Torah as being the word of God, but interpret an ambiguous verse in the wrong way, that they become a heretic and they burn in hell forever, how harsh can you get? It makes no sense whatsoever. And the Rambam himself admits that the Torah text is ambiguous, and there are many things that we may think are absolutely obligatory beliefs in the Torah are not necessarily so because of the ambiguous nature of the message of the Torah. Okay, so let's just read on. We got a couple more minutes here. His meaning is that anything which is opposed to the texts must not be believed at all, provided the texts do not give expression to an absurd idea which the reason cannot conceive. For the Torah does not oblige us to believe absurdities which are opposed to first principles, or any imaginary notions which the reason cannot conceive. But a thing which can be conceived by the mind, which we are obliged to believe, though it is opposed to nature, for example, resurrection of the dead and miracles of the Torah. An absurd idea, however, which cannot be conceived by the mind, need not be believed, even if it is plainly expressed in the Torah. Thus, the expression, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, must not be taken in its literal sense, but should be explained in accordance with the truth. Okay, right? So we don't take a knife and remove the foreskin of our heart. That is an expression which is not meant to be taken literally, and so on and so forth. He quotes now, it will skip just a bit, that Targum Unclus that express, avoid a lot of anthropomorphic expressions and understand those as metaphors. So in a sense, Rabbi Yosef Albo is a little bit Maimonidean, in he certainly doesn't take the Torah at face value. But if somebody would take it at face value, it's a mistake. But you don't lose your place in the world to come. And he quotes the famous example of the talking donkey of Bilam. Right? Did this really happen? Or was it a vision? You could argue about that. It doesn't make you lose your place in the world to come to have one interpretation or another. Now, we'll just finish up. Now he talks about the Ravid. Rabbi Avram ben David has gone even further than this. He says that even if a person understands a fundamental principle of the Torah in an erroneous manner because of a speculative error, he must not be called a heretic. We find this idea of his in his book of criticisms on Maimonides. Says that the Ravid used to be a separate book. After the printing press, it was put into the text. But there was this book, the Ravid's book of criticisms, commenting on the latter statement that one who believes in God is corporeal is a heretic. Rabbi Avram ben David says, it is true that God is not corporeal. Nevertheless, a person who believes he is corporeal, by reason of biblical and midrashic expressions, which he understands literally, must not be called a heretic. Okay, so you see how he weighs in on the issue and expands it, that the Rambam is overly assertive in creating such well-defined fundamental beliefs that if you differ in any way from those 13 fundamental principles of belief, that you go to hell. God forbid. Anything that's subject to interpretation, you don't go to hell for that. You may be mistaken, but you don't go to hell. And he quotes the Ravid and says that's what the Ravid means. I just want to point out, he says he's quoting the Ravid. You notice that his text of the Ravid is different than ours? It sounds like a quote. Rabbi Avram ben David says, but it's a lot more tame, right? He doesn't say that greater people than you, the Rambam, thought God had a body. And they just mistaken, right? He takes that out completely. He just says that the Rambam says God is not bodily, but if you believe he is, because you take things at face value, so you could be a very good Jew. You're just mistaken on that point, and you're certainly not a heretic.
Doesn't it open the door to a Christian Jew? Yeah. A little bit, I mean.
So That's a very good question, and it's a good point to stop on. What are the limits of this? If we have the ability to accept the Torah as the word of God, but interpret it according to our own speculative judgment, and maybe even in a mistaken way, that's not called heresy. It's just a mistake. You could be a good Jew. What are the limits? Believe me, when the Christians, and this is your point, Bruce, read the Old Testament, they also think the Old Testament is every word, I mean, it depends upon what type of Christians, but is the authoritative direct word of God. It's just they have a different reading of those verses. Why isn't a Jew for Jesus a pious Jew? Right? Tovim ugdolim mimenu, even better than the Rambam. It's just they read the psukim differently. So maybe it's a mistake. So they do tshuva. But to say that they're not part of the Jewish people, right? Isn't that going beyond the pale, as Rabbi Yosef almost says, and as the Ravid apparently seems to suggest? What are the limits? So hang on to that thought, because this will be a very good introduction to, as we move on to other views. We have the Rambam, we have the Ravid and Rav Yosef Albo now. We're going to see other views which are shocking, absolutely shocking, that come from not only good Jews, maybe better than the Rambam as Jews, but rabbis who are accepted as authoritative in their time, who say things that it's very hard to believe they said them, and you just will pause there. So this is, I hope you'll be able to sleep for the next week, and Bezrat Hashem will go on with the discussion of, is God a nobody? Have a great week, everybody.